Joining me to discuss Modi administration's 10 years and the foreign policy of the government then and how it's going to shape up now is Dr. Shashi Tharoor, a member of parliament from the Congress party. Thank you so much for joining us, Dr. Tharoor. Let's begin with the oath-taking ceremony. It was quite a grand event, but also 7 foreign dignitaries from near neighborhood to the Sagar diplomacy. We saw them all over there. What do you make of the invitations? The fact that, of course, China certainly would have been invited as neighborhood, but Pakistan also not there. Very different approach from 2014. What's the messaging of the government here?
Well, first of all, I welcomed this the first time the Prime Minister did this back in 2014. It sends a good signal that we see ourselves as embedded in the subcontinent and we want the leaders of the subcontinent to feel they have a stake in the Prime Minister's inauguration. I think it's a fine tradition. However, excluding Pakistan, China is not an issue because China is not part of the subcontinent. But excluding Pakistan sends, I believe, an unfortunate signal that we don't see any prospect of normal relations with them. And that is actually quite unnecessary because there hasn't been any sustained hostility from Pakistan for quite some time. You remember their gesture of opening up the Kartarpur corridor and so on. And since peace is in our interest as well, there might have been an argument for signaling a thaw on this occasion and allowing the page to be partly turned by inviting the Prime Minister of Pakistan. Now, he might have regretted, he might have declined or whatever, but at least we would have made the gesture. This snub, which is what it is, I think sends an unfortunate signal that India is not interested in peace with Pakistan.
Right, but with Pakistan, that's not just the case. There has been an attack that took place just yesterday in Jammu, and that was only yesterday too. So how do you really see the situation with Pakistan?
But the invitations, the swearing in had already started when that attack occurred. So, that could not have been a factor in the non-invitation. The invitation decisions were made earlier and everybody was already in India when this attack occurred. So that's not an excuse. Having said that, that is a very serious issue, and we definitely need to find out how this happened, where it's come from, whether the Pakistanis have begun to ratchet up their militancy in Kashmir and so on. So it's a security issue that needs to be dealt with as a security problem.
Okay, then let's just talk about the challenges for Prime Minister Modi ahead in the next 5 years. China certainly seems like one of the biggest challenges for India today.
Well, look, I think definitely China is a very serious problem because India has traditionally been very good at playing both sides of every conflict. In the famous superpower conflict of the Cold War, we stayed non-aligned. But we don't really, I believe, have a non-aligned option when one of the two contenders in the new emerging global confrontation between the US and China is sitting on our border and behaving in a rather hostile manner towards us. You're talking about a country which has, for the first time, wantonly and without provocation on our side, abandoned a 46-year-old understanding between the two countries about the ceasefire line. We had agreed to disagree on where the lines lay between the two countries, the line of actual control, I beg your pardon. We had agreed to disagree on where that line lay. We had nonetheless been able to have both armies patrol in 65 agreed patrolling points right across the LOAC without any incident, no shot being fired in anger, and certainly no casualties after 1976. And then what happens? The Chinese unilaterally barge in, take over 26 of those 65 points. They park themselves, start constructing enduring structures, not just temporary patrolling tents or whatever, but enduring structures. And then after doing that, they, when our soldiers go unarmed and say, what the heck are you doing? You've got to get out of the way. It's our turn to come here. They push them off a cliff. There is a gruesome fight and 20 of our people lose their lives. Now, this is simply not acceptable. And the government has said it's not acceptable. They've done nothing about it. And what is worse, they have continued to treat China as normal in every respect, including by increasing our import dependence on China, which has gone up by over $100 billion since that incident in May of 2020. So there is something really wrong with this picture. It's as if the government is almost schizophrenic about dealing with China. They have been craven on the border. They have refused to take tough action. Tough action would have included recalling our ambassador for consultations and sending their ambassador back, and starting to give them a little bit of irritants, for example, by playing the Taiwan card or the Tibet card that is always available to us but has never been used. And at the same time, to convey and signal to the Chinese, we take this much more seriously. We don't seem to have done that. Instead, we continue to conduct relations with China, business as usual, almost even-handedly with our friends on the other side of the divide, and at the same time, increase our import dependence on them. There's something really, really wrong with this.
Well, that's true, but Dr. Tharoor, China is a challenge and will remain a challenge. Look, today I can ask you this question. Should you have come to power, should the India alliance have won, how would you have dealt with China? It is critical in terms of supply chains and the global economy, yet its aggressive posturing does pose a threat to India. So there are no alternatives over here. How do you then look at China?
I'm referring to the specific incident on the border, which, had that been reversed, then we would not have had a problem in continuing trade. The problem is a failure to reverse it has been accompanied by this submission to them on the supply chain issues you point out. I want to give you an example of how the Congress dealt with this, the famous Samdorong Chu incident in 1987, where we stood our ground against the Chinese militarily and pushed them back. And after the standoff, the Chinese finally realized that their attempt to encroach on disputed territory was not going to stand. Here, you may remember that our own Tibetan volunteer force captured a hill when the Chinese had done this in Galwan to our people. But inexplicably, we withdrew from that hill, even though it had put the Chinese at a strategic disadvantage, in return for some very vague promises of talks, which not only did not materialize in a substantive way, but which have not changed the ground reality. So the truth is, there is a very serious deficiency in the manner in which we've handled that issue. Now, I caveat what I'm saying by saying that obviously we in the opposition have no access to classified information. There may be confidential exchanges between the countries or confidential intelligence information that only the sitting government has privy to, and which may modify the analysis I'm giving you. But from the outside, this is the way it looks. And it's shocking that the government has refused to take the opposition into confidence, has refused to discuss the matter in Parliament, or even brief Parliament fully on these situations. These are legitimate questions the opposition could have asked. If the government, for whatever reasons of national security, had wanted to do that behind closed doors, even that would have been possible. Their failure to do anything, and instead to mislead the nation by the Prime Minister actually saying that we are going to that the Chinese koi ghusa nahi hamare desh mein aur koi hamare territory ko chhin nahi liya. That, I think, was a very, very unfortunate signal, because the Chinese got the message that all this Prime Minister cares about is appearances and public statements and public realities, and he doesn't really care about what the reality is on the ground. And in addition to what I mentioned about the 26 patrolling points, we've seen renewed construction of residences in the so-called new villages the Chinese are building across the border. There's a very systematic attempt to change the reality so that whenever a settlement is achieved, it will no longer be on favorable terms to India, but only to the Chinese, because the Chinese have changed the reality on the ground.
The other big area is our own immediate neighborhood. Now, we have friends, we have allies, but we also have difficult neighbors. But we saw them all invited, including the Maldivian president, the Nepalese president, as also, while we have great ties with Bangladesh, there have been some niggling issues with Bangladesh as well. So how do you see these countries and the challenges ahead with the neighborhood?
Bangladesh has still been substantively a very good friend. I mean, the important thing to note about Bangladesh, of course, is that the government there is a secular government that is opposed by the very same Islamist extremists who have been hostile to India as well. So we can make common cause with that government, and that's understandable. But if you look everywhere else, you're looking at Nepal, where the Chinese have made significant inroads in the north, including through infrastructure construction of roads and railway lines. And the influence of the Chinese ambassador in Nepal has now become as significant as the Indian ambassadors used to be. We are seeing in Sri Lanka a very delicate relationship, badly handled by Delhi. For example, the tin ear shown by the government in raising the Kachativa issue publicly in the course of an election campaign will simply give the Chinese another opening to cultivate the Sri Lankans. Maldives is already on the negative side of the ledger. Pakistan, we know the government has been completely unwilling to try and smooth the path and improve relations. Where is it on the neighborhood? China, we've already talked about. So where is it on the neighborhood that the government has anything proud to point to? Even Bhutan has become very much more friendly to the Chinese than it used to be. And again, this may be inevitable, but we are not looking at any particular wins on the subcontinent. And that's not something we can be terribly happy about. We have seen slight erosions and sometimes major erosions in our standing in each of our neighboring countries.
The other big challenge, Dr. Tharoor, for Modi administration is going to be handling of the Khalistani issue. Now, we do know that they have tried very hard to ensure that there is no space for Khalistanis, but it doesn't seem like that space is shrinking in the West, as also within the country where you have two Khalistani sympathizers having won elections.
Well, look, I genuinely think that this has been mishandled. The Khalistan issue, for any of us who know Punjab, have traveled in Punjab, have spoken to Punjabis across the political spectrum and of various walks of life, Khalistan has no traction whatsoever. Nobody in Punjab is secessionist. When I say nobody, there will always be some fringe, almost crackpot elements for any cause anywhere in a vast country like ours. But there is no serious movement there. The allegations have often been that our own agencies are sometimes playing with fire in encouraging a few extremist elements for short-term political gain. And this was often being alleged about Amritpal Singh when he came back and suddenly emerged out of nowhere, that there was something inexplicable about the ease with which he was able to suddenly become a significant voice in Pakistan when no one had heard of him before. And there is a worry about how, perhaps because our government really doesn't see Khalistan as a threat, they're happy to use it as a bogey. But in foreign countries, particularly in the Western world, it genuinely is a threat, because some of the diaspora are so disconnected from our reality here that they are willing to indulge in sort of fantasies of secession and creating a separate republic and so on. And there are always people willing to stir up trouble for India abroad, including particularly Pakistan, which we know has been a significant finance source and also a source of military training for some of these diaspora Khalistanis. Now, I understand fully the importance of the government taking that side seriously. And I think that the only mistake they have made, unfortunately, is to apparently, according to the allegations from foreign countries, to have condoned attempts at assassinating some Khalistani elements on the soil of friendly Western democracies. And that everyone knows is a no-no, because those are not countries which in any way are complicit in attacks on us. If you had gone and assassinated a terrorist sponsor or a terrorist himself in Pakistan, no one would mind, because Pakistan has been a source of terror attacks on us. Doing it in Canada, as has now been alleged, attempting to do it in the US, is extremely unwise and shows some real problems, has created a difficulty in those relationships. But, sorry, just to finish and complete the argument, I do want to say, however, that I share our government's frustration with the manner in which Canada has dealt with Khalistani secessionism on its soil, the political pandering to secessionist elements, and particularly the failure to actively prosecute the elements behind the Air India bombing of 1985. Those are very difficult to forgive. The Canadians have this slightly naive view about secessionism. They say, well, we allow the Quebecois to have referendums on secessionism. We allow the Quebecois to open offices abroad. Why can't you see it that way? Well, we don't see that, because the Quebecois are no longer and have never really done anything remotely like the Air India bombing, and are no longer, in any case, preaching violent secession, whereas Khalistani elements are. And so I'm not suggesting we should have any patience for that. But we should know as a democracy and a diplomatically skilled nation how to deal with this with foreign countries, short of the kind of lawless behavior that we're being accused of today.
Okay, so there are challenges ahead, but there's also been achievements. There have been achievements in the last decade. India was put on the global map. We've seen how India's position on Russia-Ukraine war, a very firm stand, whether if we like it or not. Israel-Hamas war, a very firm stand there. So there are achievements also in terms of foreign policy of this administration.
I'm sorry, I have to disagree fundamentally with your very premise. Not only was India already on the global map, it was in a far better position on the global map. Certainly, since the fact that I've lived abroad for all those years and I've seen how India's stature kept going up over these years, and in particular peaked in the first decade of the 21st century, when Davos was hailing India as the world's fastest growing free market democracy, when President Barack Obama, when asked to name the 3 most impressive world leaders, put Dr. Manmohan Singh first in his experience of world leaders, that when India was included in the G20 in the first place because of Dr. Manmohan Singh and India's stature as well as a growing economy and a large and flourishing democracy. And let's not forget 2 other things. Our stature has gone down because whereas we used to have an almost fawning and glowing press in the Western democracies, in the last 10 years of BJP rule, we've had nothing but a negative press. Go and do a search on the internet of any of the top 50 publications in the democratic world and the Western world. And I'm sorry, there are nothing but articles about Islamophobia in India, attacks on minorities, mob vigilantism, cow lynchings. It's been a sad collection of erosion of freedom of the press. This is what the Western world reads about India for the last 10 years. Our stature has plummeted. The G20 presidency was by alphabetical rotation. In fact, the government of India had to go to Indonesia and ask to swap with us so that we could have the last year just before the elections. So please don't give us credit, give this government credit for things it doesn't deserve. I'll tell you what it does deserve. Mr. Modi has shown an extraordinary amount of energy, personally, in taking our diplomacy to very many more countries than any previous prime minister, and I've applauded him for that. He has, remarkably for somebody with his track record in domestic politics, he has done an outstanding job of improving relations with the Muslim countries and the Gulf in particular, and I have applauded him for that. So it's not that I'm being critical across the board, but I will not accept the fawning media praising him for things where no praise is deserved and overlooked. Yeah.
I'm the last one to really fawn over any government over here, but yes, we do know that there have been achievements during Dr. Manmohan Singh's time too, and he also took India to a different level altogether. But there have been certain achievements here as well, especially when it comes to Russia-Ukraine war, Israel-Hamas war, India's position, and the position India has taken so far on that front.
Now that was the same thing. The standing our ground with Russia was on the Ukraine war, and I will say that though I was initially critical of the language we used, or rather failed to use, when the Russians invaded a sovereign member state of the United Nations with no provocation, and we were rather mealy-mouthed in our initial statements. Subsequently, I will agree that we behaved well. And I said so in Parliament that we were the first country to come up with substantial humanitarian aid for Ukraine. We evacuated our students rather effectively, although again, there's a good tradition of having done that in earlier conflicts in Libya, Yemen, and the Gulf, the Kuwait-Iraq war, by other governments. So I'm not saying that, again, this is unique, but it was something we did well. And then subsequently, our ability to have raised our imports of oil and gas from Russia without at the same time incurring sanctions from America, that was adroitly done, and I'm all praise for that now. So you will have noticed that I have not continued to repeat my criticism of our initial Ukraine policy, where the criticism was justified. Having said that, the general perception that India is not always demonstrating the courage of its convictions is worth addressing. Why was it that we were unable, when the Russians marched into Ukraine, to even repeat principles we have stood by for the previous 70 years? Inviolability of borders, respect for sovereignty of particularly of UN member states, inadmissibility of the use of force to settle international disputes. These are all principles we've articulated at least since the days of the so-called Panchsheel. What is the matter with us that we couldn't bring ourselves to say any of this? If Russia is our friend, we should be able to say that our friend did something wrong, and they did do something wrong. But anyway, that's one issue. At the end of the day, as you say rightly, our policy has come out all right, and I hope it remains sustainable for the longer term.
Okay, finally, let's just talk about the promises that were made by this administration. Will they be able to fulfill those promises in the 5 years to come? They spoke about United Nations and UNSC permanent membership. Do you think that's feasible? That's something that's achievable in the next 5 years? We do know that China is a major stumbling block for India, but is that something that's long term?
Well, this is really not the fault of this government or the previous government. It's actually a reflection of the international realities that India alone will not get into the Security Council. It'll have to be part of a broad brush reform. And there are very many other contenders, and every contender has rivals. If the Chinese don't want us there, there are the Brazilians who feel they have a claim from Latin America, the Argentinians and Mexicans beg to differ. In Europe, the Germans want in, and the Italians want them not to come in. In the other part of Northern Asia, the Japanese would like to be there, and the Chinese aren't keen on that. And we also have resistance from Pakistan and Indonesia in our closer neighborhood. So there are a lot of countries who don't see why this reform is necessary when they will not benefit from it. And they have been dragging the process out. I was at the United Nations when Dr. Boutros Ghali, the Secretary General, famously said in 1992 that he wanted Security Council reform done and dusted by the Golden Jubilee of the organization. That was in 1995. The 50th anniversary went by, the 60th has gone by, the 70th has gone by, and now the 75th has gone by, and it doesn't seem to be on the horizon. Because any formula to reform the UN Security Council requires, first of all, the agreement of 2/3 of the member states in a General Assembly resolution. And then that resolution has to be ratified by 2/3 of the member states, and that includes all 5 permanent members in the ratification process. So you need a formula that is both acceptable to the bulk of the world and is not unacceptable to the 5 powerful members. And I don't really see this easily happening, which is one of the reasons why we should actually try and increase the frequency of our becoming elected members of the Security Council, on the terms that, given how important we are in the world, our voice needs to be heard there more often. In the long term, however, if the Security Council seems completely resistant to reform, we should also very actively and very overtly start giving greater importance to other forums such as the G20, where we are there as a right, and we could use them as platforms for larger things, just as we have under this government de-emphasized SARC because of Pakistan and promoted BIMSTEC instead. In the same way, we can say that, look, as long as the Security Council is an unrepresentative body, we are going to try and give more importance to bodies like the Quad, the G20, and so on. I think that then may send a message to people who value the UN that we really want to see India given a respectable place at the table of the UN. Otherwise, a UN where India sort of downgrades its involvement is not good for the world.
POK is another thing that was mentioned during poll campaigns, taking Pakistan-occupied Kashmir back. Now, is it just poll promise, or are we looking at maybe the government working towards moving on that front?
No, there is definitely a continuum in India amongst all governments. I have frequently stated my own strong view that there is no such thing as a BJP foreign policy and a Congress foreign policy. There is only Indian foreign policy and Indian national interests. But Indian national interests evolve with this changing circumstances in time. If Nehru were alive today, he wouldn't be conducting a Nehruvian foreign policy unchanged. He would be adapting to today's circumstances. So to that degree, changes happen, but that doesn't mean that there is no continuity. The basic underpinnings of our view of the world, our fundamental faith in strategic autonomy, our emphasis that foreign policy must serve the interests of the Indian people, their welfare, their security, their development, all of these things are common to every government and cannot but be indispensable to any future government as well.
Dr. Tharoor, thank you so much for joining us here on India Today Global.